An arrogant millionaire hires a pizza delivery woman to pretend to be his fiancée at a business dinner. But what she did when she got there left all the guests in shock. Before we begin the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Brian Montgomery was deep in thought. His company's sales were plummeting, and investors were growing more restless by the day. To make matters worse, the most important business dinner of his career was the following evening, and he needed to show up with the perfect fiancée. The problem? He didn't have anyone. Frustrated, irritated, and hungry late at night, Brian decided to order a pizza from Domino's to distract himself from the chaos in his mind. When the delivery arrived, it was Alyssa Carter, a young delivery driver wearing a worn-out jacket and sporting a tired but genuine smile. "You're late," Brian snapped impatiently. "Well, maybe if your mansion wasn't so big, I could have found the door faster," Alyssa replied with a cheeky smile as she handed over the pizza. Brian raised an eyebrow, unused to people talking back to him. He paid for the order, but Alyssa's uncommon beauty and confident demeanor caught his attention. As she turned to leave, Brian stopped her. "Wait. Is there a problem?" she asked, turning back. "What's your name?" Brian asked, frowning as if piecing together a puzzle. "Alyssa, why?" she replied, crossing her arms suspiciously. Brian took a deep breath. An absurd but possibly brilliant idea was forming in his mind. "Alyssa, I need a favor." "A favor?" Alyssa frowned. "Look, my job is to deliver pizzas, not do favors for weird millionaires." Brian let out a rare chuckle. "It's a job," he clarified. "I need you to pretend to be my fiancée." Alyssa blinked in disbelief. "What?" "You heard me. I need a fake fiancée for a business dinner tomorrow night. It's urgent, and you're exactly what I need." She started laughing, but stopped when she realized he wasn't joking. "You're insane." "I'm not." Brian pulled out his wallet and flashed a stack of cash. "I'll pay you well." Alyssa looked at the money, then at Brian. Her rent was overdue, her debts were piling up, and she needed the money desperately. "How much?" she asked hesitantly. Brian smirked. "Enough to change your life." After a moment of hesitation, she sighed. "Fine, but if this goes wrong, I'm charging double." Later that night, after finishing her shift, Alyssa was still trying to process how her evening had taken such a bizarre turn. From delivering pizzas to now being prepared to pose as a millionaire's fiancée, her life felt surreal. Brian Montgomery, with his serious and arrogant demeanor, seemed convinced this was a practical solution. To her, it seemed like a massive mess. "The dinner is tomorrow night," Brian said as he descended the marble stairs of his mansion. "I have less than 24 hours to make you look presentable." "Presentable?" Alyssa raised an eyebrow as she followed him. "Look, you hired me to play fiancé, not become your doll. I'm only doing this because I need the money. Don't expect me to turn into an actress overnight." Brian stopped at the foot of the stairs and turned to her, surprised by her attitude. Then, shaking his head, he gave a slight smile. "You don't need to act. Just smile and talk as little as possible. They don't need to know much about you, just that we're engaged." "Engaged?" Alyssa laughed, crossing her arms. Funny hearing that from someone who clearly doesn't know the meaning of the word. Brian ignored her comment and kept walking across the polished floor. Before Alyssa could argue further, a tall, elegant woman entered carrying shopping bags. "Mr. Montgomery, I brought the pieces you requested." The woman shot Alyssa a quick glance, her judgment barely hidden. "We'll need alterations," the woman remarked, her tone slightly disdainful. Alyssa crossed her arms, undeterred. "Listen, fancy pants, you may be rich, but if you think you're going to turn me into someone else, you're mistaken," Alyssa shot back. Brian sighed, visibly losing patience. "Do your best, Clara. We don't have much time." Before Alyssa could protest, she was whisked away to an upstairs room. The next few hours were a whirlwind of dresses, shoes, and instructions. Alyssa couldn't understand how wealthy women put up with such things. When it was all over, she barely recognized herself. The mirror reflected an elegant woman, but the feeling of being out of place was overwhelming. Back downstairs, Brian was waiting near the fireplace. When he saw her, he paused for a moment, his eyes scanning every detail. "This will work," he finally said, with the detached tone of someone approving a project. "Wow, thanks," Alyssa replied, her sarcasm sharp. "I love being made to feel like a brand new chair." Brian didn't respond, only smiled slightly. "Let me ask you something," She leaned forward a bit. Why didn't you just hire someone from one of those agencies? I know they exist for stuff like this. Brian hesitated, a rare occurrence for someone who always seemed so composed. Because I need something genuine, he finally said, meeting her gaze with seriousness. My rival will be at the dinner, and he's the kind of person who digs into everything. If I showed up with someone who seemed rehearsed, he'd figure it out immediately. And you think I'm genuine? Alyssa laughed, shaking her head. You have personality, he said, surprising her. That's hard to fake. Alyssa stayed silent, processing his words. It still felt like madness to her. The next evening came quickly. It was time for the dinner. Their driver was already waiting, and the silence in the car was heavy. Alyssa's heart raced as she watched the bustling streets outside. Finally, she decided to break the ice. You haven't mentioned what exactly I need to do besides smile. Smile as little as possible, he said, not taking his eyes off the window. Be polite but reserved. Don't get too involved in the conversations. Sounds easy, Alyssa replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Trust me, it won't be. They arrived at the restaurant shortly after. The sophistication of the place hit Alyssa as soon as she stepped inside. Sparkling chandeliers hung from the ceiling, the tables were adorned with flawless floral arrangements, and the people looked like they had just stepped off magazine covers. Brian offered her his arm, and Alyssa hesitantly took it. He led her to a table where several men and women were already waiting. As they approached, Brian was greeted with smiles and handshakes. Brian, great to see you, an older man said, shaking his hand firmly. And this must be your fiancé. Alyssa smiled, trying to hide her nerves. Alyssa Carter, it's a pleasure to meet you. The pleasure is ours, the man said, eyeing her briefly before turning back to Brian. You never fail to surprise us. They sat down, and the conversation quickly turned to business. Alyssa stayed silent, listening and observing. But at one point, one of the men directed his attention to her. And you, Alyssa? What do you do? She swallowed hard, casting a quick glance at Brian, who didn't seem inclined to rescue her. I work in deliveries, she finally said, deciding honesty was the best policy. But I'm planning to start my own business soon. The man raised his eyebrows, clearly intrigued. Before he could ask another question, Brian stepped in. Alyssa has an inspiring vision for the future. It reminds me of why I started my company in the first place. Brian's firm tone ended the conversation, but Alyssa noticed that not everyone at the table seemed convinced. She kept her composure for the rest of the dinner, answering politely whenever someone addressed her. When it was finally over, Brian guided her back to the car. The silence between them felt heavier now. So how did I do? Alyssa asked, breaking the quiet. Brian took a moment to respond. It was acceptable. Acceptable? She huffed. Considering I was thrown into this with zero preparation, I think I did way better than acceptable. This time, he looked at her with a faint smile. Maybe. But that was just the beginning. Alyssa frowned, confused. What do you mean by that? Brian looked away, turning his gaze back to the window. This charade will need to last longer than one night. Alyssa's heart sank. She knew there was more to this than Brian had let on. The dinner was just the start, he explained. The deal I'm trying to close requires long-term trust. These people aren't just looking at numbers, they want consistency, something solid. Alyssa crossed her arms, a mix of frustration and curiosity building inside her. So, you're telling me this engagement thing will go on for weeks? Maybe months? Yes, he replied bluntly, leaving no room for negotiation. If it doesn't feel real, everything could fall apart. And you think I can pull this off? Pretending to be your fiancé for that long? She challenged him with her eyes. I don't have another choice, Brian admitted, avoiding her gaze as he turned back to the window, visibly uncomfortable. When they arrived at the mansion, Alyssa went straight to the room she'd been given, without saying another word. She needed a moment to herself, away from the formalities, Brian's expectations, and the pressure of a role she never wanted. Sitting on the bed, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. The elegant dress and flawless makeup were still there, but she felt like she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. The next morning, Brian was already working in his office when Alyssa came downstairs. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, but the tension from the night before lingered. Clara, the woman who seemed to manage everything around Brian, appeared in the room with a controlled smile. "Good morning, Miss Carter. Mr. Montgomery asked me to prepare breakfast for you." "Oh, right, thank you," Alyssa replied, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the formality. As she ate, Brian appeared. He was impeccably dressed, as always, but there was something in his expression that hinted at exhaustion. "I hope you got some rest. We have more to do today," he said, grabbing a cup of coffee and sitting at the table. "More? What else do you want me to do?" Alyssa asked, setting her utensils down. Brian placed his cup on the table carefully, as if controlling every move. "There's an event this weekend. We need to be ready." "Another event?" Alyssa shook her head, exasperated. "I thought this would be over quickly." "I made it clear last night it wouldn't be," Brian said, meeting her gaze with seriousness. "You really think you control everything, don't you?" Alyssa shot back, feeling her frustration rise. "It's not about control, Alyssa. It's about survival." His response caught her off guard. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of something different in Brian. Not just arrogance, but something deeper, maybe even vulnerability. "Survival?" she asked, softening her tone. Brian looked away, seeming to wrestle with how much to reveal. "My company is in a delicate position. These investors can either save it or destroy it. If I fail, everything I've built will be gone." The sincerity in his voice made Alyssa pause. Despite her irritation at the situation, she realized Brian wasn't as invincible as he seemed. "So what exactly do you need me to do at this next event?" she asked, trying to sound practical. Brian relaxed slightly, sensing she was willing to listen. "Just keep doing what you did at the dinner. Be polite, confident, and, most importantly, convincing. These people are like sharks. If they sense even a hint of weakness, they'll attack." Alyssa couldn't help but smile faintly. "Sharks, huh? And what are you, Brian? A goldfish?" He stared at her for a moment before smiling, a rare sight. Maybe a bigger shark. The rest of the day was spent on more rehearsals and adjustments. Clara brought more outfits and spent hours explaining etiquette rules. Alyssa, though reluctant, realized she was getting better at playing the role Brian needed. There was something almost therapeutic about learning to walk and talk like someone who belonged in that world. By the end of the day, Alyssa was sitting in the garden, savoring a moment of quiet, when Brian appeared. He seemed more relaxed than usual, though still carrying the weight of someone who could never fully let go. "You're starting to adapt," he said, sitting beside her. "I guess it's the least I can do, considering what you're paying me," she replied, trying to lighten the mood with humor. Brian smiled briefly, but his gaze soon turned distant. "Thank you for agreeing to this, Alyssa. I know it's not easy." The unexpected sincerity made him seem less distant, almost human. Alyssa felt a wave of empathy but quickly pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to forget this was just a job, a facade with an expiration date. "I just hope this works," she said, looking at the horizon. Brian nodded, the silence between them now more comfortable. They both knew what lay ahead would be even more challenging, but for now, the moment felt like a rare reprieve amidst the chaos. The next morning, Alyssa woke up with a strange sense of restlessness. The sunlight streamed through the large bedroom windows, illuminating the impeccably decorated furniture. Even after days in the mansion, she still felt out of place. She didn't belong in that world, and the role she was playing felt heavier by the day. But there was something else that unsettled her. Brian Montgomery. The man was an enigma, and she knew there was far more behind his facade of absolute control. Descending the stairs, Alyssa found Brian in the living room. He was on the phone, his voice steady and low as he gave instructions to someone on the other end. Noticing her presence, he ended the call and turned to face her. "Good morning. I hope you're ready for a busy day," he said in his usual straightforward tone. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. "Did I have a choice?" He ignored her remark, walking over to a table covered with scattered papers. "Tomorrow's event will be more challenging than the dinner. It's not just about smiling and nodding. These people will want to know you, test you. We need to make sure you're prepared." Alyssa sighed, settling into a nearby chair. "Why does it feel like I've become the centerpiece of your plan?" Brian gave a faint smile but remained serious. "Because you have." Before she could respond, Clara entered the room, carrying more dresses and looking slightly rushed. "Mr. Montgomery, I brought the final pieces for adjustments." She needs to look perfect for tomorrow. Perfect, Alyssa muttered, rolling her eyes. I think I've heard that word more this week than in my entire life. Brian gestured for Clara to proceed. Once again, Alyssa was whisked upstairs, where she spent hours trying on dresses and shoes. Every detail seemed meticulously planned. The chosen dress for the event was elegant but understated, designed to convey sophistication without appearing unapproachable. When she returned to the living room, Brian was reviewing a list on his tablet. He glanced up, quickly assessing her outfit. Better. Now we need to work on your posture and how you present yourself. My posture? Alyssa crossed her arms, visibly annoyed. What else do you want to change? My breathing? Brian sighed, stepping closer. Alyssa, if you want this to work, you need to accept that every detail matters. She rolled her eyes but knew he was right. As much as she hated admitting it, Brian's perfectionism made sense. Any mistake she made wouldn't just affect him, it would also reflect on her. They spent hours rehearsing. Brian simulated scenarios she might face at the event while Alyssa did her best to keep up. At first, she made small mistakes, hesitating or stumbling over her words, but gradually, she began to feel more at ease. Despite his rigid demeanor, Brian guided her patiently, offering corrections and encouragement when needed. Later that evening, as they took a break, Brian surprised her by bringing over 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to her and sat beside her on the couch. You're improving, he said, studying his glass. Thanks, I think. Alyssa offered a small smile. The silence that followed felt less tense than she had anticipated. For the first time, Brian didn't seem to be analyzing her every move or word. Can I ask you something? Alyssa broke the silence. Brian looked at her, intrigued. Depends on the question. Why are you really doing all this? I know it's to save your company, but it feels like there's more to it. He remained silent for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he let out a sigh. My company is all I have. I've worked my entire life to build it. I can't lose it. Isn't there anyone who can help? Family? Friends? Alyssa asked gently. Brian shook his head. My family is distant, to put it mildly, and friends are hard to keep in this world. Alyssa noticed a hint of sadness in his voice that he rarely let show. Behind the controlled exterior, Brian seemed like a lonely man, perhaps even more lost than she had imagined. You're not so different from me, she said without thinking. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. What do you mean? You're also trying to fit into a role. The only difference is yours is permanent. Brian didn't respond, but the intensity in his gaze suggested her words had struck a chord. The next day, the atmosphere in the mansion was even more tense. Clara was constantly on the move, ensuring everything was perfect for the event. Alyssa, though nervous, felt more prepared. She had spent the previous evening mentally reviewing everything she'd learned, determined not to make mistakes. When it was finally time to leave, Brian appeared in the foyer, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that accentuated his commanding presence. He extended his hand to Alyssa, who hesitated for a moment before taking it. Ready? He asked with a slight smile. No, but let's pretend I am, she replied, mirroring his smile. While they were driving to the event, Alyssa glanced at Brian. As complicated as it was to deal with him, there was something she was starting to admire. His determination, his ability to stay calm under pressure. He wasn't perfect, but he also wasn't the cold-hearted man she had initially imagined. You know, you're not as bad as you seem, she said, breaking the silence. Brian looked at her, surprised, before offering a faint smile. I'll take that as a compliment. When they arrived at the venue, Alyssa took a deep breath, adjusting her dress. She was about to step back into a world that wasn't hers, but this time, she felt a bit stronger. Brian offered his arm, and she accepted, fully aware that the next step would be crucial. The ballroom where the event was held was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the space, their light reflecting off mirrored walls adorned with gold accents. Alyssa walked in beside Brian, feeling the guests' eyes on them immediately. Every movement seemed deliberate, every smile carefully measured. The weight of the moment was tangible, but she stood tall, trying to appear as confident as Brian. Remember, just follow my lead. Don't get too involved, he whispered, his voice firm and low. She nodded, holding the smile she had practiced so many times. Brian guided her through the crowd, greeting guests with his usual composure. He seemed entirely at ease in that environment, as if it were second nature to him. For Alyssa, however, it felt like stepping into uncharted territory, but her pride wouldn't let her show any sign of insecurity. Soon, they reached a small group where Peter Harrow was at the center of attention. Alyssa recognized the name instantly, recalling the hours she had spent rehearsing how to conduct herself in his presence. Peter was a middle-aged man with neatly combed gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through people. "Brian," Peter exclaimed, offering a polite but commanding smile. "What a pleasure to see you here." "The pleasure is mine, Peter," Brian replied, shaking the man's hand firmly. "I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Alyssa." Alyssa extended her hand, maintaining the serene expression she had practiced. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Harrow." "The pleasure is mine, my dear. Brian has told me a lot about you." Peter's smile widened, but there was something in his gaze that made her feel on guard. Peter's next words carried an air of curiosity. He seemed to be testing Alyssa's intentions, asking subtle questions about how she and Brian had met. Alyssa answered calmly, sticking to the script they had prepared. Brian watched closely, ready to step in if needed, but so far she was handling herself well. "And what do you do, Alyssa?" Peter asked, his tone casual but with an undertone of challenge. Alyssa took a deep breath, recalling Brian's instructions. "I was between jobs when I met Brian, but I'm working on plans to start my own business. He's been a great source of encouragement." "Interesting." Peter tilted his head slightly, as if weighing her response. At that moment, Brian smoothly shifted the conversation to his company's future plans. He spoke with such confidence that the group's attention quickly turned to him, allowing Alyssa a moment of relief. Still, Peter's calculating expression lingered in her mind. The event continued with Brian and Alyssa moving through the ballroom, engaging with different groups. Alyssa started to notice patterns in the looks and smiles she received. Some were genuine, but many carried judgment or suspicion. Despite her nerves, she forced herself to maintain her composure. At one point, while Brian was deep in conversation with another businessman, Alyssa was approached by an elegant woman with a smile that seemed more poisonous than friendly. "So, you're Brian's fiancée?" the woman asked, extending her hand politely. "Yes, I'm Alyssa," she replied, shaking the woman's hand. "I'm Miranda. I've worked with Brian on a few projects in the past." Her smile sharpened. "He never mentioned you before." "Well, our story is recent but intense," Alyssa responded, her smile unwavering. Miranda studied her for a moment before letting out a soft chuckle. "I hope you know what you're getting yourself into. Brian can be complicated." "I enjoy a good challenge," Alyssa replied firmly, feeling her blood boil, but keeping her calm. Miranda looked surprised by the quick response, but before she could continue, Brian appeared next to Alyssa, gently placing a hand on her back. "Miranda, I see you've met my fiancé," he said with a polite yet slightly tense smile. "Oh yes, we were just chatting," Miranda replied before walking off with a wave. Once she was gone, Alyssa turned to Brian, whispering, "Who was that?" "Someone who enjoys meddling where she doesn't belong," he replied curtly. Before they could continue their conversation, Peter approached again, this time with a larger group. He seemed more relaxed, but his piercing gaze hadn't softened. "Brian, tell me's the big day?" he asked, glancing pointedly at Alyssa. "We're planning for next semester." Brian answered smoothly, without hesitation. "Hope I get an invite," Peter said, smiling, though his tone hinted at skepticism. Brian nodded, quickly steering the conversation in another direction, but Alyssa could sense a shift in the atmosphere. Peter was testing them, searching for cracks in their story. Later, as the event wound down, Brian led her to a quieter corner of the room. His usual composed demeanor was visibly strained. "What's wrong?" Alyssa asked, concerned. "Peter's not convinced. He's suspicious, and that's a problem," Brian said, scanning the room as though expecting someone to be watching them. "What can we do?" Alyssa asked, trying to stay calm. Brian sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "We need to be flawless. He's going to keep testing us, so you have to be ready for anything." Alyssa nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She understood this was more than just a game to Brian. His company, his future, everything was on the line, and now so was hers. When the event finally ended, they left together, maintaining their facade until the very last moment. In the car, the tension was almost tangible. Brian stared out the window in silence, while Alyssa, though exhausted, felt a small sense of accomplishment for making it through without any major mistakes. Finally, Brian broke the silence. "You did well." Alyssa turned to him, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you. But I think we still have a lot of work ahead." He nodded, letting out a heavy sigh. "Yes, we do." As the city lights blurred past the car windows, Alyssa realized this charade was becoming increasingly complex. It wasn't just about fooling investors or saving Brian's company anymore. Something deeper was building between them, something neither seemed ready to acknowledge. The next morning, Alyssa sat in the mansion's garden, trying to collect her thoughts. The previous night had been more of a trial than she'd expected. And though she'd managed to keep up appearances, she knew the danger wasn't over. Peter Harrow was sharp, and Miranda, with her cutting attitude, seemed like the kind of person who thrived on stirring trouble. Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that letting her guard down even slightly would lead to disaster. Brian appeared in the garden shortly after. He was, as always, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, but something about his demeanor seemed different. He looked less tense, as though a night's sleep had eased some of the burdens he carried. Still, the serious expression in his eyes remained. "Are you all right?" he asked, interrupting her thoughts. "Trying to be," Alyssa replied with a faint smile. "It's not exactly easy going from pizza delivery girl to millionaire's fiancé." Brian sat down beside her on the wooden bench, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "You did better than expected. Peter still has doubts, but that was inevitable. The important thing is, he didn't manage to throw us off." "Is that a compliment?" Alyssa asked, raising an eyebrow. Brian gave a small smile. "Maybe." She laughed softly, but the gravity of the situation quickly returned. "So what now? What's next?" "We need to strengthen the story," he said, crossing his arms. "Peter will keep looking for holes, and Miranda, well, she enjoys meddling, so we need to be ready for more questions." "Great," Alyssa groaned, leaning her head back. "More boot camp with Clara, I assume?" Brian's brief smile returned before he stood up. "Actually, today we're doing something different." Alyssa frowned, intrigued. "Different how?" "We're going out," he said, pulling out his phone to call the driver. "If we want our story to feel real, we need to be seen together outside these formal events." She blinked in surprise. "You mean, like a date?" "Call it that if you want," he replied with a faint hint of irony. Not long after, they were driving across the city. Alyssa gazed out the window, trying to guess where Brian was taking her. He remained quiet for most of the ride, but there was something about his expression that seemed more relaxed than usual. The car finally stopped in front of a large park surrounded by tall trees and walking trails. Alyssa looked at Brian, clearly surprised. "A park? I didn't think this would be your kind of place." "Not everything in my life is about business," he replied, stepping out of the car and opening the door for her. Still curious, Alyssa followed him. As they strolled through the park, she noticed how carefree the people around them seemed, enjoying the sunny day. It was a stark contrast to the tense, calculated world Brian lived in. "Why here?" she asked, glancing at him. "It's a place where I can disconnect for a while," he said, his tone lighter than usual. "I don't usually bring anyone here, but I thought it might help us reinforce our story." Alyssa realized that behind Brian's controlling facade was someone who rarely allowed himself to unwind. As they walked, she began to feel a more genuine connection with him, as if, for the first time, he was showing her a truer version of himself. After some time, they sat on a bench near a lake. Alyssa looked at the water, sparkling under the sun, before turning to Brian. "Can I ask you something?" "That depends on the question," he replied with a faint smile. "Why do you do this?" she asked, motioning to the surroundings. "Why go through so much effort to save something that clearly drains you?" Brian stayed quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much he wanted to share. Finally, he let out a sigh. "My company is all I know. It's what keeps me busy. Without it, I don't know who I am." Alyssa felt a lump form in her throat. There was a sadness in his words she hadn't expected. In that moment, Brian seemed more human, less like the arrogant millionaire she knew, and more like a man trying to find purpose in his life. "And you?" he asked suddenly, catching her off guard. "Why did you agree to this?" Alyssa shrugged, turning her gaze back to the lake. Because I needed the money, and because somehow it felt less unbearable than continuing with a meaningless routine. Brian studied her for a moment, as if seeing something new in her. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her look away, her face warming. After a while, they decided to head back to the car. The silence between them felt more comfortable now, as if they had reached some kind of mutual understanding. When they arrived at the mansion, Brian seemed more at ease than she had ever seen him. He walked her to the hall, stopping before heading upstairs to his office. "Thank you for today," he said sincerely. Alyssa gave him a small smile, feeling something unexpected stir inside her. It wasn't so bad. Brian chuckled softly before walking away, leaving her alone in the hall. Alyssa went up to her room, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Something was shifting between them, and while she knew it was all still a charade, she couldn't help but wonder if the line between fake and real was starting to blur. That night, Alyssa tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake her thoughts about Brian. The walk in the park had shown her a side of him she hadn't expected. He was more than the arrogant man who had hired her for this farce. There were layers to him, a complexity she wasn't sure she wanted or was ready to understand. But what unsettled her most was how it was affecting her. She had taken this role for the money, to escape her debts, and now she felt herself getting drawn in ways she couldn't control. The next morning, the tension in the mansion was unbearable. Alyssa could feel the weight of something building in the air, like a storm about to break. As she came downstairs, she found Clara pacing back and forth, papers in hand, speaking urgently on the phone. The atmosphere was chaotic, and Brian had locked himself in his office, as he always did when something went wrong. Alyssa couldn't take the stifling mood anymore. Taking a deep breath, she decided to confront him. She opened the office door without knocking, and found him hunched over his desk, eyes focused on a stack of papers. Brian glanced up briefly before returning to his work, as if she wasn't even there. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" Alyssa demanded, crossing her arms. "Not now, Alyssa," he replied, his eyes never leaving the documents. "Not now," she repeated, irritated. "You're dealing with some crisis, the whole house is in chaos, and no one knows what's going on. If we're pretending to be a couple, at least tell me the truth." Brian let out an exasperated sigh, tossing his pen onto the desk. He stood up and ran a hand through his hair, clearly at his breaking point. "You want the truth? Peter Harrow is pressuring me like never before, and now one of the most important investors has pulled out. This could ruin everything. And where do I fit into this?" Alyssa asked, her heart racing. "I've done everything you asked. I've attended the dinners, pretended to be your fiancé, and now you act like I'm a burden? Because you don't understand what's at stake." Brian exploded, his voice echoing in the office. "To you, this is just a job, but to me, it's my entire life falling apart. You think I don't care?" Alyssa shot back, stepping closer. "I threw myself into a world that isn't mine, learned to fake it, follow your rules, all because I thought I could help. And now you're treating me like I'm disposable?" Brian shook his head, clearly frustrated. "This was never about you, Alyssa. It's about my company. It's about saving everything I've worked so hard to build. Never about me?" Alyssa repeated, incredulous. "I'm here, pretending to be your fiancé, enduring stares, questions, even insults. And you have the nerve to say it's not about me?" "Because it's not," Brian yelled, gesturing toward the desk full of documents. "All of this is bigger than you can understand. Bigger than both of us." Alyssa felt the weight of his words hit her like a punch to the chest. She took a deep breath, trying to control the anger rising inside her. "You're a coward, you know that?" she finally said, her voice trembling but full of determination. "You hide behind this excuse of doing everything for work, as if that justifies treating people like disposable tools. Maybe you deserve to lose everything, Brian, because you don't know how to value what you have." Brian stepped closer, his face full of frustration. "I never asked you to stay. If you think this is so unbearable, why don't you just leave?" Alyssa felt the sting of tears but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Maybe that's exactly what I should do," she replied, her voice dangerously calm. "Because clearly you can't see that without people, all this money and power mean nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Brian stared at her, but there was something in his eyes that wasn't just anger. It was a mix of pain and regret that he didn't seem to know how to express. But as always, he chose to keep his walls up. "If you want to leave, then go," he said, turning to face the window. "I won't stop you." Alyssa felt her chest tighten, but she wouldn't drag this out any longer. She turned and walked away, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the mansion's silent hallways. When she reached her room, she began packing her things, her heart heavy with the decision she was making. Clara appeared at the door, hesitant. "You're really leaving?" Clara asked softly. "I am," Alyssa replied without looking back. "There's no point in staying." Clara sighed, but didn't try to talk her out of it. Alyssa knew that, deep down, even Clara understood things had gone too far. That afternoon, Alyssa left the mansion, taking the first taxi she could find. As the car pulled away, she looked back one last time at the imposing silhouette of the house that had been her home for a brief time. Something inside her knew she was leaving more than just a lie behind. Back in her small apartment, Alyssa tried to pick up her life again. She started working, but nothing felt the same. The days dragged on, and every small moment felt hollow. She found herself thinking about Brian more than she wanted to admit. She remembered the conversations, the rare moments when he let his guard down. She even missed the silences between them. Brian, on the other hand, couldn't focus on anything. The negotiations with the investors remained tough, and he knew time was running out. But what bothered him most was Alyssa's absence. The mansion felt bigger and emptier than ever, and the silence was now unbearable. He tried to justify to himself that he had done the right thing, that pushing her away was the best way to protect her from the chaos. But the more he tried to convince himself, the emptier he felt. Alyssa had become more than just part of his plan. She had become an essential part of his life, and now he didn't know how to fill the space she had left. One night, while in his office, Brian picked up his phone and stared at the screen. He wanted to call her, but didn't know what to say. Apologies never came easily to him, and the thought of exposing his feelings made him uncomfortable. But deep down, he knew he had to do something. Time dragged on as he debated his next step. Brian understood that if he stayed on this path, he risked losing not only his company but also the one person who had managed to break through his walls. He just needed to find the courage to admit it, to her, and to himself. Brian spent the night pacing back and forth in his office. He knew he had to act, but every time he thought about reaching out to Alyssa, a wave of doubt and fear took over. Hesitation wasn't typical for him. Brian Montgomery was known for his determination and control, yet now he felt vulnerable, something he didn't know how to handle. The next morning, with dark circles under his eyes and a more serious expression than usual, Brian finally made his decision. He got in his car and drove to the address Clara had given him without asking too many questions. During the drive, his heart felt heavier with every mile. He didn't know how she would react to seeing him, but he knew he couldn't move forward without at least trying. Alyssa was at home, sitting on her couch with a cup of coffee, trying to organize her thoughts. It had only been a few days since she'd left the mansion, but it felt like an eternity. She was still grappling with why her argument with Brian had affected her so much. He was stubborn, arrogant, and often insufferable. Yet there was something about him that drew her in, something that made her feel like, in some inexplicable way, he needed her as much as she needed him. The sound of a knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Alyssa got up slowly, her heart racing, unsure why she felt so nervous. When she opened the door, she found Brian standing there, his expression a mix of determination and regret. "Brian? What are you doing here?" she asked, surprised. He took a deep breath as though summoning all his courage. "We need to talk, Alyssa. I can't keep going like this." Alyssa hesitated for a moment, but then opened the door fully and stepped aside, allowing him in. Brian glanced around the small apartment, so different from the mansion they were used to. But he wasn't there to judge the space. He was there for her. "Talk," Alyssa said, crossing her arms and bracing herself for whatever he had to say. Brian was silent for a few seconds, as if carefully choosing his words. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual, almost vulnerable. I messed up. In the office that day, I said things I shouldn't have. I was stressed, under pressure, and I took it out on you." He paused, looking her directly in the eye. "And that was wrong. You didn't deserve that." Alyssa held his gaze, her face showing little emotion. "So you came here just to apologize?" "No." Brian shook his head. "I came because I realized you mean more to me than I was willing to admit. Alyssa, I started this as a contract, a way to save my company, but it turned into something more. You've shown me things about myself I didn't want to see, made me feel things I haven't felt in a long time. I don't know how to be good at this, but I know I don't want to lose you." Brian's words hit Alyssa like a wave. Her heart raced, but at the same time, doubt crept in. She knew Brian wasn't the type to admit weakness easily, but was he being sincere? Or was this just another attempt to maintain control? "Brian, I need to know. Is this real?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Or are you here because you think winning me back will help save your company?" He took a step closer to her. "Alyssa, I've never been good at trusting people. It's always been easier to keep everything under control. But with you, I can't. You challenge me, break me down, and that terrifies me, but it also makes me want to be better. I'm not here for the business. I'm here because I've realized that without you, everything I've built means nothing." Tears started to well in Alyssa's eyes, but she blinked quickly, trying to hold them back. Brian's words felt genuine, and she knew it wasn't easy for him to say them. Even so, she needed to be honest with herself. "I've developed feelings for you too, Brian," she finally admitted, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "But I can't be part of your life if this is just another charade. I want something real, something beyond contracts and lies." Brian nodded, his expression serious. "I do too. I don't want to pretend anymore, Alyssa. If you'll give me a chance, I want to try for real. I want to prove that we can make this work." She studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she stepped closer to him. "All right, Brian. Let's try. But I need you to be honest with me, always. I can't do this alone. I promise," he said with a faint smile, as if relieved she had agreed. They spent the rest of the day talking, going over what had gone wrong and how they could improve. For the first time, Alyssa felt she was truly getting to know Brian, without the masks and walls he usually hid behind. He was more human than she had imagined, more vulnerable, and it made her like him even more. But as always, the calm didn't last long. By late afternoon, Brian received a call from his team. It was Clara, and her tone was urgent. "Mr. Montgomery, Peter Harrow made an unexpected move. He's trying to convince other investors to pull out, claiming your relationship with Alyssa is a sham," Clara explained. Brian felt his blood boil. "He's coming at us directly. We won't let this happen. Alyssa and I will handle this together." Alyssa, who had been listening to the conversation, looked up at him. "Together?" Brian smiled, taking her hand. "Yes, together. If he wants to test us, we'll show him we're stronger than ever." Brian's office was busier than ever. Papers were scattered everywhere, phones rang incessantly, and meetings seemed endless. But now, something was different. Alyssa was by his side. She sat in one of the chairs in front of his desk, reviewing notes and suggesting ideas to deal with the crisis Peter had created. Her face was serious, but there was determination in her eyes. "We need to address this head-on," Alyssa said, placing one of the papers on Brian's desk. "If we let Peter spread more doubt, it'll be even harder to regain the investors' trust." Brian nodded, watching her closely. He'd always thought Alyssa was smart, but seeing her mind work under pressure impressed him even more. "I agree," he replied, looking over the document she'd given him. "But as you suggested, we need a creative approach. Just responding to the accusations isn't enough. We have to show them something that proves Peter is wrong." Alyssa smiled faintly, encouraged by his approval. "Then why not start by showing how strong your company really is? The numbers, the successful projects, those speak louder than any rumor." Brian studied her for a moment, admiring her practicality. "You're right. We need to turn this into an opportunity." They began working together on a plan. Alyssa, with her practical mindset, came up with strategies to improve the company's public image, while Brian used his expertise to fine-tune the technical details and prepare the presentation for the investors. Their dynamic was seamless and efficient. And despite the intensity of the situation, It felt like they were on the right track. Later that night, while Brian reviewed the final numbers, Alyssa brought over 2 cups of coffee, setting one down beside him. "You need a break," she said, sitting in the nearby armchair. Brian looked at her and gave a faint smile. "Since when are you my boss?" "Since I realized you need someone to remind you to take care of yourself," she replied playfully. Brian let out a short laugh, but there was something deeper in that moment. He leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Thank you, Alyssa," he said sincerely. "For all of this, for being here. I don't know how I'd be handling this without you." She felt her face grow warm, but kept her gaze steady on him. "You'd do the same for me." The next morning, their plan began to take shape. Brian called the key investors for an emergency meeting where he would present proof that his company was solid and Peter's accusations were baseless. Alyssa insisted that the event be open to the press, turning what could have been a moment of weakness into an opportunity to display strength. The conference room was packed when Brian stepped onto the stage. He was impeccably dressed, and his posture radiated confidence. Alyssa watched from the front row, silently rooting for everything to go smoothly. Brian began his presentation with authority, showcasing the numbers, successful projects, and future plans for the company. His voice was clear and steady, and he knew exactly how to hold the audience's attention. As Brian spoke, Alyssa noticed something. He had changed. The man who once seemed distant and cold now showed genuine passion for what he did. He seemed more human, more real. And she knew that, in some way, she had played a part in that transformation. When the presentation ended, the room erupted in applause. Brian stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by investors and journalists, all praising his transparency and vision. Alyssa hung back slightly, smiling with pride. But before she could slip away, Brian found her in the crowd. "Come here," he said, taking her hand and pulling her close. Alyssa tried to protest. "Brian, this is your moment." "No," he interrupted, looking directly at her. "This is ours. I couldn't have done it without you." Her cheeks flushed as cameras flashed around them. But for the first time, Alyssa didn't care about the attention or the questions. She was exactly where she needed to be. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Brian seemed more relaxed than Alyssa had ever seen him. He shrugged off his jacket and tie, tossing them onto the couch before turning to her with a smile. "I think we finally turned things around," he said, his voice full of relief. "I told you you could do it," she replied, crossing her arms and smiling back. Brian studied her for a moment, as if trying to commit the moment to memory. Finally, he stepped closer, taking her hand. "Alyssa, I know this is still new for us, but you've changed my life," he said softly, his tone sincere. "It's not just the company or what we've accomplished together. It's you." Alyssa felt her eyes well up with tears, but she didn't look away. "You've changed mine too. I never imagined something like this could happen, but here we are." Brian smiled and pulled her into a warm embrace. The world around them seemed to fade, and for the first time, everything felt exactly as it should. That night, as Alyssa was in her room getting ready for bed, there was a soft knock at the door. "Can I come in?" Brian asked. "Of course," she replied, curious. Brian stepped in, holding a small envelope in his hand. He handed it to Alyssa, who carefully opened it. Inside was an elegant invitation to an exclusive event at a luxury hotel, but what caught her attention was the note included with it. "Thank you for showing me what truly matters. I want this to be just the beginning of what we can build together." "Brian." She looked at him, surprised. "What is this?" Brian stepped closer, smiling. "An invitation to something special. Something just for us. I want to take you somewhere to celebrate everything we've accomplished. No business, no rivalries. Just us." Alyssa couldn't help but smile. "It sounds perfect." Brian leaned in for a gentle kiss, sealing the moment. He knew there were still challenges ahead, but with Alyssa by his side, he felt ready to face them. The night sky was clear, stars sparkling overhead as Alyssa gazed out the car window. Brian was driving, but he hadn't revealed their destination, only saying it would be something special. She tried guessing what he had planned, but Brian remained enigmatic, smiling every time she asked. "You know I hate surprises, right?" Alyssa said, teasing. "You'll like this one, I promise," he replied, keeping his eyes on the road. With every mile, the mystery deepened. Finally, the car stopped in front of a property lit by tiny lights that twinkled like fireflies. Alyssa stepped out, awestruck by the sight. It was a beautifully arranged garden, with fresh flowers, elegantly set tables, and a candlelit path leading to a small gazebo at the center. "Brian, what is this?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "A dinner for us," he replied, offering her his arm. "Something special to celebrate everything we've achieved together." Alyssa felt her heart race as he led her to the gazebo. In the center was a perfectly set table with intricate details, the setting straight out of a fairy tale. The air was filled with the scent of flowers, and soft music played in the background. "You did all this yourself?" she asked, amazed. Brian smiled and pulled out a chair for her. "I had some help, but the idea was mine. You deserve something special, Alyssa, something to show how much you mean to me." They talked as dinner was served. The food was delicious, but Alyssa barely noticed the dishes. Her attention was entirely on Brian, who seemed more relaxed and genuine than ever before. She'd never seen him like this, so open and vulnerable. "You know, when I first met you, I never imagined we'd end up here," she said with a smile. "Neither did I," Brian replied, his eyes sparkling. "But I think that's what makes it so special. It was unexpected, but it's real." Alyssa felt her cheeks flush. She knew Brian struggled to express his emotions, which made his words even more meaningful. She reached out, holding his hand across the table, feeling the warmth of his skin. After dinner, Brian invited her to take a walk in the garden. The lights along the path created a magical atmosphere, and Alyssa felt as though she were in a dream. They walked in silence until they reached a small pond surrounded by softly lit trees. Brian stopped and turned to face her. He looked nervous, something Alyssa rarely saw in him. "Is everything okay?" she asked, concerned. He took a deep breath and pulled something out of his pocket. When he opened his hand, Alyssa saw a small velvet box. Her heart raced. "Alyssa, from the moment you came into my life, everything changed. You made me see what truly matters, challenged me to be better, and showed me what it means to love. I know I'm not perfect, but with you, I feel like I can face anything," Brian said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He knelt down, opening the box to reveal a stunning ring. "Alyssa, will you marry me?" For a moment she was speechless, tears streaming down her face. Then she nodded vigorously. "Yes, Brian. Yes, I'll marry you." He smiled, slipping the ring onto her finger before standing and pulling her into a tight embrace. Alyssa felt the world fade away as her heart swelled with happiness. Let's play a little game with those who only read the comments. Type Coca-Cola in the comments, and only those who make it this far will understand. Now let's get back to the story. After the proposal, Brian led her back to the gazebo, where a small surprise awaited them. Clara and a few of Brian's closest friends were there, smiling and clapping as they entered. Alyssa realized Brian had planned every detail to make the moment unforgettable. "I wanted to celebrate this with the people who matter to us," Brian explained, squeezing her hand. Alyssa smiled, feeling happier than she ever thought possible. They toasted to the new chapter they were beginning, and for the first time, Alyssa felt like she had truly found her place. Later that night, after everyone had left, Brian and Alyssa were alone again. Sitting under the starry sky, they talked about their dreams and plans for the future. Brian shared his vision for expanding his company while maintaining a better work-life balance. Alyssa, in turn, spoke about her idea of starting a small business of her own, something that truly excited her. "I want you to know, I'll support you in everything," Brian said, holding her hand. "Your dreams are just as important as mine." Alyssa's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, they were from pure joy. She knew that together, they could build something extraordinary, something far beyond money or success. That night, as they returned home, Alyssa felt completely fulfilled. Everything they'd faced, the struggles, the challenges, now seemed worth it. She watched Brian as he prepared for bed and felt her heart swell with love. He turned to her, smiling. "What's on your mind?" "Nothing, just thinking about how love can change everything, even the most unlikely people." Brian laughed and pulled her close. "I guess we're proof of that." They fell asleep in each other's arms, ready to embark on a new journey together, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it side by side. The days following the proposal felt like a dream for Alyssa and Brian. The announcement of their engagement was met with excitement from close friends and Brian's team, and the couple began planning the details of their wedding. Life seemed to finally settle into a peaceful rhythm. But as Alyssa knew all too well, peace rarely lasted forever. It all started with an unexpected call. Brian was in an important meeting when Clara appeared at the door, her face more serious than usual. He immediately sensed something was wrong and quickly ended the meeting, following Clara to his office. "What's going on?" he asked, closing the door behind him. Clara placed a tablet on the desk and showed him an anonymous email that had just arrived. The content was threatening, claiming to have evidence that could ruin Brian's reputation and questioning the authenticity of his relationship with Alyssa. "This is Peter again," Brian said, his voice filled with anger. "He couldn't take me down publicly, so now he's trying to sabotage our personal happiness." "What are we going to do?" Clara asked, clearly concerned. Brian took a deep breath, trying to control his frustration. "We'll get ahead of it. I want you to gather all the information you can about this so-called evidence. We'll dismantle this threat before it gains any traction." Later, when Brian returned home, he found Alyssa in the living room, laughing as she flipped through wedding decor catalogs. For a moment his tension eased at the sight of her, but the weight of the situation quickly returned. He knew he had to tell her. "Alyssa, we need to talk," he said, sitting beside her. She noticed the seriousness in his tone and set the catalog aside. "What happened?" Brian explained the email and Peter's potential intentions. She listened carefully, her smile fading as he spoke. "He won't stop, will he?" she asked, shaking her head. "It feels like no matter what we do, he always finds a way to attack." "He's desperate," Brian replied. "He knows he's lost in business, so now he's targeting us personally. But I promise you, Alyssa, I won't let him hurt us." She placed her hand over his, squeezing it gently. "We're in this together, Brian. He can't beat us if we stand united." The next morning, Brian and Alyssa met with Clara's team to discuss the situation. The investigators they had hired discovered that Peter was trying to bribe former employees of Brian's to fabricate false stories about him and Alyssa. One ex-employee had even recorded a video claiming their relationship was a staged arrangement from the start. "This is ridiculous," Alyssa said, crossing her arms. "Who would believe something so absurd?" "Unfortunately, some people might," Brian replied, scanning the documents in front of him. "Especially if Peter manages to plant these stories in the right places." "So what can we do?" she asked. Brian leaned forward, his expression serious. "We're going to expose Peter before he has a chance to launch his attack. I want Clara to organize a press conference. We'll present the evidence we have against him and show everyone who he really is." Alyssa nodded, but an uneasy feeling grew within her. While she trusted Brian and his ability to handle crises, she knew this fight was deeply personal. Peter wasn't just attacking their business, he was going after the truth of what they had built together. In the days that followed, preparations for the press conference were intense. Brian gathered his team, while Alyssa helped with the details, ensuring everything was perfectly aligned. She understood that this was a pivotal moment and there was no room for mistakes. Finally, the day arrived. The room was packed with journalists, all eager to hear what Brian Montgomery had to say. He stepped onto the stage with Alyssa by his side, both exuding confidence. Brian began speaking, addressing the recent attacks and unveiling evidence that linked Peter to the attempts to sabotage his company and personal life. When it was Alyssa's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and approached the microphone. She knew her words could make all the difference. "When I met Brian, I had no idea how much my life would change," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Our relationship may have started in a way that seems unlikely, but what we've built together is real. We've faced challenges that could have broken us, but they've only made us stronger." She looked at Brian, who gave her an encouraging smile before continuing. "I know some people want to question the truth about us, but all I can say is there's no lie here. What we have is love, and that's something no one can destroy." The room was silent for a moment before erupting in applause. Brian and Alyssa walked off the stage hand in hand, feeling the weight of the past weeks finally starting to lift. Later that night, as they sat on the mansion's porch, Brian looked at Alyssa with a contented smile. "You were amazing today," he said, holding her hand. "We were," she corrected with a smile. "But I think we can finally catch our breath now, don't you?" Brian nodded, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was still planning something. "There's one more thing I want to do," he said, pulling something from his pocket. Alyssa watched curiously as he handed her a small envelope. She opened it to find a note that read, "Get ready. Tomorrow will be unforgettable." "What does this mean?" she asked, laughing. Brian just smiled mysteriously. "You'll have to wait and see." That night, as Alyssa slept, Brian gazed at her with a mixture of love and gratitude. He knew that with her by his side, he could face anything. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one he couldn't wait to start. The sun was just rising when Alyssa woke up to the gentle breeze coming through the open window. Brian had already left the bed, and a note reading, "Today will be unforgettable," lay on the pillow beside her. Smiling, she wondered what he was planning this time. Ever since they met, he had a way of turning ordinary moments into something extraordinary. As she made her way downstairs, Clara was waiting with a soft-colored dress and an excited expression. "Mr. Montgomery asked me to help you get ready," Clara said with a twinkle in her eye. "He's preparing something very special. This is becoming a habit." Alyssa joked as she took the dress. But it never stops being surprising. Once she was dressed, Alyssa was escorted to a car waiting at the mansion's entrance. She had no idea where she was going, and the driver revealed nothing, maintaining the suspense. When the car stopped, Alyssa stepped out and saw Brian in the distance, standing in front of what appeared to be a small private garden. The space was adorned with fresh flowers, wooden arches draped with ivy, and cozy benches surrounding a simple yet elegant altar. Only a few close friends and family were present. Alyssa was speechless as she realized what was happening. Brian walked up to her, gently taking her hand with a soft smile. He seemed calmer than ever, as though this moment was the culmination of everything they had been through. "What is this?" Alyssa asked, though she already knew the answer. "Our wedding," Brian said, his voice filled with emotion. "I realized I didn't want to wait. I didn't want to put off what we have for another day. This is the beginning of our future, and I can't think of anything more important." Alyssa's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. "You're impossible. And you love that about me," he teased with a quiet laugh. The couple walked together to the altar, where an officiant waited to make their union official. The ceremony was simple, but every word spoken carried deep meaning. When it was time for the vows, Brian held Alyssa's hands tightly, looking straight into her eyes. "Alyssa, you came into my life like a storm. You changed everything I thought I knew about myself, about love, about life. Today, I promise to be the man you deserve every single day. I want this to be just the beginning of a story we'll build together, side by side." Tears streamed down Alyssa's face as she shared her own vows. "Brian, you showed me that love can come in the most unexpected ways. You challenged me, supported me, and made me see my own worth. Today, I promise to stand by you in every step, every success, and every struggle. Because with you, everything is worth it." Their heartfelt "I do" was followed by a warm kiss, drawing applause and laughter from their guests. The rest of the day was filled with joy, music, and lively conversation. Alyssa couldn't stop smiling as she looked at Brian. Everything they had endured had led them to this moment, and she knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Later, away from the celebration, the couple walked hand in hand through the garden, enjoying the quiet of the night. Alyssa glanced at Brian, feeling her heart swell with contentment. "I don't think I've ever been this happy," she said. "This is just the beginning," Brian replied, pulling her closer. "With you by my side, there's nothing I can't face." They stopped under a tree, and Brian looked up at the starry sky before turning to her again. "Alyssa, there's something I want you to know," he began. "Everything we've been through, every challenge, everything we've built together, it was you who made it all possible. You didn't just save me, you transformed me. I'm a better man because of you." Alyssa felt her chest tighten at the intensity of his words. "Brian, I've changed because of you too. You've shown me that true love exists, even when it comes from the most unexpected places." They stayed there for a long time, simply enjoying each other's presence. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the love they shared. They knew there would still be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together. From that day on, Brian and Alyssa began a new chapter in their lives, one filled with hope, shared dreams, and a love that had overcome every obstacle. What do you think? Did Alyssa make the right choice in forgiving Brian? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories. And check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen.